In the freezing darkness of Redwood Forest, a 10-year-old boy blows into a wooden whistle beneath the howls of wolves. No one answers, except a creature once beaten into silence. A wild horse with fire in its eyes. This wasn't just escape, it was a gallop that saved a soul. It is Lave. Subscribe now to experience our most emotional, gripping, and unforgettable cinematic stories. The screen fades in from black to the deep, resin-colored stillness of a redwood forest. Shafts of pale morning light stab through towering trunks. Dust and pollen float like memory suspended in time. She sits there brittle and unmoving on a splintered bench carved decades ago, perhaps by hands long dead. Her back is hunched. A thick gray cardigan hangs off her shoulders like a coat of past winters. Her eyes, glazed and milky, scan the distance with no urgency, as if waiting for a name to return. Margaret Whitaker is 82, and her world is evaporating moment by moment. Behind her, footsteps barely stir the pine needles. A small boy approaches slowly, almost reverently, as if intruding on a sacred silence. 10-year-old Noah Whitaker carries a knitted scarf in his arms. It's worn and unraveling at the edges. He kneels beside her. No words are spoken. With careful fingers, he wraps the scarf around her neck. She flinches, not in fear, but confusion. Her eyes blink toward his face, struggling to place it. "Hi, Grandma," he whispers. She smiles faintly. Not recognition, just muscle memory. Noah sits beside her, their shoulders barely touching. In his lap lies a battered leather notebook. He opens it, revealing childish handwriting stretched across the pages like tiny earthquakes. He writes slowly, "If tomorrow you forget who I am, I will still remember who you are." He underlines the sentence twice. From his pocket, he takes out an object small, wooden, sanded smooth, a whistle, carved in the shape of a pine leaf. The grains of the wood swirl like a fingerprint. Flashback, quick and vivid. Margaret's younger hands handing it to him near the fire one Christmas. Her voice, clear then, "If you're ever lost, blow it. Not for help, for courage. It only calls what believes in you." He holds it tightly now. The present swallows the memory. A gust rustles through the trees, bringing with it a faint sound, the distant rumble of a diesel truck, the clang of an empty beer bottle tossed on pavement. Civilization, always creeping. Cut to the outskirts of the Redwood town. It's the kind of place that forgot how to grow. Wooden signs cracked by sun, storefronts shuttered with handwritten for lease signs. A church bell rings, not for service, but out of habit. The community bulletin board is cluttered with missing pet flyers, a few garage sale posters, and one article ripped from the local paper, half torn and faded. Animal rights protest shuts down equine ranch. Investigation into cruelty. Horses seized. Charges dismissed due to lack of witness. Below it, someone had scribbled in black Sharpie. No one cares about horses, or people. Back in Margaret's modest cabin at the edge of the woods, time moves differently. Lucia enters quietly. Mid-32nd, wiry but grounded, with skin browned by sun and a presence that fills the air without trying. Her nurse scrubs are mismatched pink floral top, navy pants, and she carries a plastic grocery bag full of necessities. Adult diapers, canned soup, a single mango. She pauses in the doorway when she sees them, Margaret and Noah still outside on the bench, still not speaking. Lucia steps out and joins them, standing behind them like a sentinel. "She awake?" she asks softly. Noah nods. "Sort of." Lucia kneels in front of Margaret, brushing a leaf off her lap. "Hi, beautiful." Margaret turns toward her voice, confused. "Who are you?" Lucia doesn't flinch. Just someone who remembers. She places a warm hand over Margaret's and squeezes gently. Then, to Noah. "Did she eat anything?" He shakes his head. Lucia sighs and sits beside them. "They only care about the elderly once they're dead, you know. Then they write poems and hold memorials. But now, they just call us liabilities." Noah doesn't answer. His fingers rub circles into the whistle. Lucia notices the notebook in his lap. "Still writing your stories?" He nods. She tilts her head. "What's this one about?" "It's not a story," he says. "It's a map, in case she forgets where we are." Lucia stares at him. Not with pity, but with something quieter. Respect. Inside the house, sunlight cuts through sheer curtains, illuminating photographs turned face down on shelves. A once-played piano, now home to dust and silence. The television screen reflects a blank blue menu, flickering with offers of channels no one has paid to unlock. Lucia starts boiling water in the kitchen. Noah helps Margaret back inside. She hums something tuneless as she walks. Her gait is shuffling but determined, like a ghost trying to remember how to dance. He guides her to a chair and sets her down. She stares at him again. "What did you say your name was?" "Noah." She smiles. "That's a nice name." His voice catches. "You picked it." A long silence. Then she whispers, "Oh." Lucia watches from the doorway, her jaw clenched. Later that afternoon, Noah walks alone down the street to the town library, his backpack slung low. Kids on bikes whiz past him without saying a word. A teenager in a hoodie spits on the sidewalk beside him. The librarian, Mrs. Whitmore, lets him in without greeting. He heads straight for the animal encyclopedias. His hands hover over the H section, flipping through pages on horses, wild mustangs, equine behavior. He scribbles something in his notebook. Trust isn't trained, it's earned. Outside the window, the town fades further. Across the street, weeds creep up the fence of what was once Redwood Equine Center. Its wooden archway still stands, but the sign is faded, letters peeling. A rusted lock hangs on the front gate. No sounds come from inside. No hooves, no neighs, no laughter. Just wind, whispering secrets. Cut to Margaret in bed that evening, eyes open, fixed on the ceiling. Noah sits nearby, reading aloud softly. The horse hears what others cannot, smells rain before it falls, feels danger before it arrives. She turns toward him. "Are we in danger?" she asks. He hesitates. "No," he lies. The lights flicker once, then stay steady. Lucia, from the next room, on the phone with someone, her tone hushed but angry. "You can't keep ignoring this. She's not safe alone anymore. I know he's just a kid, but he's the only one who gives a damn." Beat of silence. "No, Evelyn hasn't shown her face in weeks. I don't care if she's the legal guardian on paper." She hangs up. Her eyes fill with frustration and something else. Helplessness. In her pocket, she fingers a photo Margaret in her 42nd, arms around a teenage boy and girl. One of them is Noah's father, the other is Evelyn. The photo has a crease down the middle, right between the siblings, like a split that was always coming. Cut back to the living room. Margaret clutches the wooden whistle in her sleep, mumbling, "Don't let them take him. Don't let them take my Noah." Noah stands in the doorway, frozen, listening. Outside, the redwoods sway, unbothered, eternal. He steps out into the night. Stars pierce through a blanket of ink above. He puts the whistle to his lips, not to blow it, but just to feel its weight. Its shape, a cry of some distant animal, echoes from the forest. He doesn't flinch. In the darkness, he whispers, "If you're out there, I won't be afraid." His breath curls like smoke, and somewhere, in the sleeping earth, something stirs. The morning she arrived, the sky over Redwood hung low with a colorless mist, one of those coastal shrouds that made time feel suspended, like a breath waiting to be released. The knock at the door was too precise, too rehearsed. Noah opened it slowly. She stood there in a tailored black coat, leather gloves gripping a designer handbag, sunglasses still on despite the absence of sun. Her lipstick was the same shade Margaret used to wear in the 72nd, only colder. Her perfume entered the house before she did. "Hi, sweetheart," Evelyn said with a voice polished in silk and smoke. "Look how much you've grown." Noah stepped back. Margaret, asleep in the armchair with a crocheted blanket across her lap, stirred faintly but didn't wake. Lucia, in the kitchen, wiped her hands on a towel and stepped forward, intercepting. "You're early," she said, not masking the suspicion in her voice. Evelyn smiled, the kind of smile that was never meant to reach the eyes. "Couldn't wait to see my family." Her gaze swept across the room, not landing on the people, but the furniture, the edges of the cabinets, the framed photographs. Noah had turned face down the day his father died. She paused at the old grandfather clock near the fireplace and tapped its frame once, noting the dent near the base. Lucia noticed. "I see you've made yourself quite comfortable here," Evelyn said casually. Lucia didn't respond. Evelyn turned to Noah, crouched to his level like she was hosting a charity event. "How would you like to go on a little trip today? Just you and me. A nature drive. The woods, the river, ice cream?" Noah hesitated. Lucia interjected. Margaret had a rough night. He should stay close. But Evelyn already had her gloved hand on Noah's shoulder. "Oh, come now. Let the boy breathe some fresh air. It's not like I'm kidnapping him." Lucia's jaw tightened. Margaret stirred in the chair. "Eleanor?" she mumbled. Evelyn walked over, brushed a strand of gray hair from her mother's forehead, gently. "No, Mama, it's Evelyn, your daughter." Margaret blinked, uncomprehending. Evelyn looked back at Noah. "Get your jacket, darling. We won't be long." Noah obeyed, slowly, unsure. 10 minutes later, they were in her Lexus. The leather seat swallowed him up. Evelyn adjusted her mirror before pulling out of the gravel driveway, and for a brief moment, her face changed. Not cruel, just hollow, like a person mouthing the words of a lullaby they never believed in. The road wound upward through the forest, cutting deeper into the national park. Evelyn hummed something tuneless. Her sunglasses stayed on. "You know," she began, "your father loved it out here when we were kids. He used to climb every damn tree until he got stuck and screamed like a banshee. Your grandma would lose her mind. She laughed without humor. Noah watched the trees blur past. The same ones he and Margaret named from memory: sequoia, Coast Douglas fir, big leaf maple. He said you and my dad didn't talk much, Noah muttered. She glanced sideways at him. Is that what he told you? Silence. She turned down a gravel road. The forest grew denser. Her hand reached for the dashboard. With two calm gestures, she turned off the GPS, then casually removed a cloth pouch from her handbag and placed it between the seats. Inside, a burner phone, a folded paper map, a protein bar, and a bottle of water. Her smile returned. Sometimes, she said, the best adventures happen when no one knows where you are. Noah shifted uneasily. They reached a secluded trailhead. The wooden sign read, Redwood Ridge North Loop, closed for maintenance. Noah opened his mouth. This is closed. Evelyn turned off the engine. Nobody checks. It's fine. She got out. Noah hesitated, then followed. She handed him the protein bar. For the road, she said. Then she bent down to adjust his shoelace. Her fingers moved fast, practiced. In one motion, she slipped his phone from his jacket pocket, removed the SIM card, and tossed it into the underbrush. She dropped the phone itself back in his backpack. Noah never noticed. Go on up the trail, she said. I'll catch up in a sec. He walked ahead, leaves crunching beneath his sneakers. The silence of the forest wrapped around him, not peaceful, but watchful. Birds had stopped singing. After 20 steps, he turned. She was gone. The car was gone. The road was empty. He blinked. A drop of sweat rolled down his back. The cold wasn't from the air, it was something else. Evelyn, he called. No answer. He walked back to the edge of the road. Nothing. No tire marks, no footprints. Just the fading smell of perfume and a bottle of water propped against a tree like a stage prop. Noah stared at it. His hands trembled. He dug into his backpack. His phone was there, but no signal, no SIM. His breath quickened. His throat closed. He tried to scream, but it came out strangled. In his pocket, his fingers brushed the whistle. Wooden, warm, alive. He pulled it out. Blew it once. The sound echoed like a memory, sharp and plaintive. But no answer came. Only the rustling of distant leaves. Noah backed against a tree, slid down to the earth. He wrapped his arms around his knees and rocked gently. Inside his head, Evelyn's voice echoed. It's not like I'm kidnapping him. The light dimmed. Fog rolled in from nowhere. Time passed strangely. He whispered to himself, she'll come back. But the wind told another story. Dusk bled into night. The forest changed color, not darker, but deeper. Every trunk leaned closer. Every shadow breathed. Noah lit the screen of his phone just to see something glow. The battery was low. He held the whistle to his lips again. Blew twice, louder. The sound bounced through the trees, then disappeared. He closed his eyes. Tears carved slow tracks down his cheeks. He began to murmur under his breath, like a prayer. Not afraid, not afraid, not afraid. From the trees behind him, something stirred. A rustle, then another. A twig cracked, not broken by the wind. He froze. His breath stilled in his chest. From between the black trees, two eyes emerged. Low to the ground, wide, reflecting moonlight. An animal? A predator? He shrank backward. The creature stepped forward, slow and deliberate. A horse. But not just any horse. Its coat, a burnished brown, shimmered like wet bark. Its mane, dark as midnight, hung wild and unkempt across one side of its neck. Its hooves landed without sound. It didn't snort. It didn't stomp. It simply looked at him. Noah stopped breathing. The horse took another step forward. Its ears twitched. Its eyes didn't blink. He remembered something Margaret once said. Some animals are broken in ways that make them too quiet. That doesn't mean they're safe. It means they remember. The horse stared. Noah trembled. He lifted the whistle to his lips. Blew one last time. The horse flinched. Then stepped forward again. Then stopped. Silence. Long enough to make the stars feel loud. Noah whispered, "Are you lost too?" The horse tilted its head, just slightly, then turned and walked away. Noah stood. Wait, it stopped. He stepped forward. Slowly. The horse didn't move. Then, as if reaching a quiet verdict, it turned and walked again slower now, so he could follow. He did. The trees swallowed them both. Above, the sky cracked open with a streak of moonlight. Behind them, at the edge of the trail, the empty bottle of water tipped over. The forest closed its mouth. It had been hours since Evelyn vanished. The sun had gone down like a dying ember, leaving behind a forest cold enough to silence even the crickets. Noah was curled up at the base of a tree, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, head tucked beneath his jacket hood. His body shivered involuntarily, not just from cold, but from a kind of fear that crept into the bones. Fear without name, without direction. He blew into the whistle again. Once, then again. Its high, hollow sound floated between the trees like a plea. Not sharp, not desperate, just tired. A kind of calling that didn't expect an answer anymore, but still needed to be heard. Then the leaves rustled. Noah's head shot up. He wasn't sure at first. He thought maybe it was the wind, or a raccoon, or worse. But then he saw them. Two reflective discs peering at him from the darkness, wide and low, unmoving. Eyes. The shape around them emerged slowly from the shadows. Large. Animal. Unmistakable. A horse. Its body came into view like a phantom, tall and lean. A deep russet coat, dusted with streaks of gray. In the moonlight, its flanks shimmered red gold, like dying coals in a fire. But it was the mane that made Noah freeze, long, black, wild, tangled in pieces like unbrushed hair, like it hadn't known a comb in years. The horse did not approach. It stood beneath a broken canopy of oaks, hooves sunk into the moss, chest rising slowly. Every line of its body said caution. Its ears flicked once, then stilled. Its eyes narrowed. Noah didn't move. He slowly lowered the whistle, letting it hang against his chest by the leather strap. He didn't even blink. The horse took one step forward, then stopped. Another step, another pause. It was a slow-motion negotiation. Each breath between them, a silent question. Friend? Threat? Noah exhaled softly, unintentionally. The horse twitched and froze again. The standoff stretched into a silence so thick it became a sound of its own. Then, the whistle clinked softly as it shifted on Noah's chest. That sound changed something. The horse tilted its head. Another step. Closer. Noah didn't speak. He just watched as the creature advanced until its breath warmed the cold air between them. Until Noah could see the scar above its right eye, thin and pale like a crack in old leather. The boy's lip trembled. His eyes welled. The pressure of everything, of abandonment, of the night, of his grandmother's face slipping from memory, rose in his throat. A sob broke free. He turned his head, ashamed, and wiped his face with his sleeve. And then, with a gentleness that defied its power, the horse stepped in and pressed its muzzle softly against his cheek. Then it licked him, slow, firm, certain, like an oath made without words. Noah's breath caught. He turned, meeting the horse's eyes up close. They were darker than the night, but they weren't empty. They were full of something heavy and ancient. Pain, yes, but something more. Recognition. "I think you heard me," Noah whispered. The horse didn't move, didn't retreat. He reached up, cautiously, and touched the side of its neck. The horse flinched, then stilled again. They stayed like that for minutes, neither speaking, neither needing to. Eventually, Noah found a hollow in the roots of a massive tree, deep and dry, blanketed with leaves. He crawled inside, the horse watching him all the while. When he lay down and pulled his jacket tighter, he glanced back out to see the horse still there, standing guard. It didn't lie down, it didn't drift away. It stood sentinel, one eye always on the trees, on the paths behind them, like a soldier who'd spent a lifetime expecting someone to come back for them and learn they never do. Noah whispered before sleep took him. "Don't leave." The horse didn't blink. The boy slept like only someone who had truly broken down could sleep, deep, motionless, dreamless. But the horse remembered. From somewhere inside that muscular frame, inside that weather-worn skull, came a flicker, a flash of scenes not from this forest, but from another time. A fence, metal and electric, voices shouting, pain. Then, the flick of a rope, a man's hand tight, sunburned, calloused, grabbing the reins too hard. The crack of a whip, not once, many times. The snap of fear, like bones breaking. The smell of bleach and blood. The sound of a girl's laughter, once sweet, high, vanished. Then, nothing. Only the stable door slamming shut. He had once been called Rusty. Then, 403. Then nothing. Until the day the gate had been left open. Not by accident. A storm. A protest outside. Chaos. And a run. A run that had lasted days, through fields and train tracks, through places where no one bothered to look because they assumed a rescued horse had already been relocated. But he hadn't gone far. He had stayed in the woods watching, listening, surviving. Until tonight. Until the sound of a whistle that didn't command but consoled. The night deepened. Owls called out to ghosts only they could see. The wind whispered the names of trees no human had spoken aloud in years. Ranger he was. Ranger now, even if he didn't know it yet, stood like a statue. Then, movement. A far-off flicker of light through the trees. A beam. Flashlight? Ranger turned his head sharply. His ears locked forward. Something in him tightened. He stepped closer to the hollow. Noah stirred, half waking. The horse touched its muzzle to the boy's shoe. He opened his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled. A distant crunch leaves underfoot. Noah sat up, alert now. The flashlight was moving, sweeping, deliberate. Ranger stepped between the light and the boy, head low. Noah ducked further into the roots. The flashlight paused, scanning the trees. Then it disappeared, gone. But the fear lingered. Noah curled deeper into the hollow. Ranger turned back to watch the dark. And finally, just before dawn, the horse lay down. Not fully, not resting, but close enough that his flank pressed lightly against the hollow's edge. Noah reached out in his sleep and touched the warm fur, unconsciously. And the night ended like that. A boy without a home. A horse without a name. Wrapped in the hush of an ancient forest. Both of them fugitives from someone else's betrayal. Dawn rose quietly through the redwood canopy. Not with glory, but with caution, like a secret being unveiled too slowly. Pale shafts of light slipped through the branches, touching the forest floor in uneven streaks. The damp ground shimmered in patches, dew clinging to every fern, every leaf, every unspoken thought. Noah blinked against the light, disoriented by the sudden gentleness of it. His back ached from sleeping half-curled in the tree roots. He sat up, eyes searching. The horse was gone. His heart dropped into a tight knot in his chest. He scrambled out of the hollow, leaves sticking to his jacket, his breath already shortening. "Ranger?" He called into the trees, not loud, not desperate yet, just uncertain. Silence. The only answer was the low chatter of birds waking for the day. Noah turned in a slow circle. Nothing. He looked down. In the mud beside the hollow, faint impressions, hoof prints. He crouched, fingers trembling as he traced the indentations. He stood, picked a direction, and began to follow them. Each step was uncertain. The hoof prints weren't clear. The forest wasn't helpful. It offered no signs, no arrows, no markers. Only moss and silence. But he walked anyway. Minutes passed, maybe hours. His legs grew heavy. His knees buckled more than once. Still, he pressed forward. The trees parted, just briefly, into a small clearing. There, at the far edge, was Ranger, standing still, watching him. Noah froze. They stared at each other across the open space. Noah took one slow step forward. Ranger's ears flicked back. Another step. Then another. But when Noah reached out hand open, heart pounding, the horse snorted once and turned sharply, vanishing into the trees. Noah's hand dropped. He didn't cry. Not yet. He kept walking. Eventually, his foot caught on a root. He went down hard, face to the dirt, breath punched from his lungs. He rolled onto his back and just lay there, staring up at the sky through a web of branches. The pain in his elbow was sharp, but not as sharp as the one in his chest. He reached into his coat and pulled out the whistle. He held it for a long time, then lifted it to his lips, but didn't blow. Instead, he began to talk to it, not like a tool, like a person, like her. "I don't know where I am," he whispered, "or how to get home. I don't think anyone's coming." He paused. "I'm not even sure I want to go back. Because it's not there anymore, is it? You're slipping away, and she doesn't see me. And Evelyn, she left me." His voice broke. He brought the whistle closer to his mouth, held it between his palms. "I'm scared," he whispered. "But I'm not giving up." A long pause. "I won't give up." Then, from the trees behind him, a sound, a low breath. He sat up slowly. Ranger was there, half hidden behind a tangle of pine. Not moving, not blinking. Noah didn't speak. He just looked at him. And for the first time, he didn't reach out. He simply sat, letting the silence hold between them like a thread neither dared snap. Ranger stepped forward, closer, closer, then stopped just feet away. Noah's voice was barely audible. "You came back." Ranger blinked. Noah stood slowly. His legs shook. He didn't try to pet him this time, didn't even move toward him. He just turned and walked forward back into the trees. After a pause, Ranger followed. And this time, when Noah stumbled on a patch of wet moss and fell to one knee, the horse stepped up beside him and waited. Noah stood again, steadied himself by touching Ranger's shoulder gently. This time, Ranger didn't flinch. They walked like that together, Noah's hand lightly brushing the side of the horse's neck. No reins, no commands. When they came to a shallow slope, Noah hesitated. Ranger knelt. Noah stared. It was not a full bow, not submission, not domestication. It was invitation. He clambered up slowly, swinging his leg over the horse's back. His hands gripped the wild mane. The texture was knotted and coarse, like old rope. Ranger rose. Together, they moved. The forest changed beneath them. Trees once intimidating now seemed like guardians, watching their path unfold. Noah didn't guide. He didn't push. He just held on, gently, quietly. And Ranger ran not fast, but sure-footed, steady, like he was leading the boy somewhere he hadn't yet named. Back in the town of Redwood, the world was burning slowly. Lucia arrived at the cabin just after sunrise. She had a fresh bag of groceries and a worn copy of Margaret's medication chart. She knocked. No answer. She used her spare key. The house was silent. Too silent. She found Margaret still in bed, calm, eyes open, but vacant. And no Noah. She checked the kitchen, the bathroom, the back porch. Then she saw the open spot on the hook by the door, where his jacket should have been. Panic didn't hit all at once. It crept up her spine in stages. She called his name. Once. Twice. She opened his bedroom. Empty. The whistle was gone. She checked the driveway. No strange cars. No footprints. Then she opened the fridge and saw the lunch she'd packed him the night before. Untouched. She called his phone. Straight to voicemail. She tried Evelyn next. It rang. And rang. And then, "Hello?" came Evelyn's voice, syrupy as ever. "Where is he?" Lucia demanded. A pause. "I'm sorry?" "Noah, he's gone. Did you take him? Did he leave with you?" Evelyn's laugh was dry. "I've been out of town. Maybe he ran off. Boys his age do that." "You're lying. I think you're projecting. It's dangerous, you know, for a nurse to get too attached." Lucia's voice lowered. "If anything happens to him," Evelyn cut her off. "If you continue to harass me, I'll be forced to file for interference. You're not family. You're not even on his legal guardianship. Check the documents." Then the line went dead. Lucia stared at the phone, fists trembling. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She picked up the photo of Noah and Margaret on the mantel. Then her car keys. She wasn't going to let him become another missing face on the bulletin board. Back in the woods, Noah and Ranger rested by a creek. Noah slipped off the horse's back slowly, careful not to startle him. His legs were sore, unused to riding. He sat by the water, cupped his hands, drank. Ranger bent to graze nearby, never far. Noah looked at him not as a horse, not as an escape, but as someone. He took out his notebook from the backpack, tore a page, wrote with shaking hands, "This is not a dream. If you're reading this, I'm with him. He's not tame. I'm not lost. We just haven't found home yet." "What?" He folded the paper, weighed it down with a stone on a nearby log. "Just in case." Ranger lifted his head, ears flicking. Something in the wind shifted. The road ahead was waiting. And trust, once broken in both of them, was starting to stitch itself back together, one step at a time. The silence that followed Evelyn's call to Lucia didn't last long. It shattered the moment she hung up and threw the phone onto the leather seat beside her. Her manicured hand trembled slightly as she reached into her bag for a pill bottle, dry swallowed 2 of whatever she'd been prescribed or not, and then lit a cigarette with a flick of her gold-plated lighter. The cherry flared against her lips like a warning light. She was losing control. Noah was supposed to disappear. Not die, necessarily, though that would have been convenient. Just gone. Forgotten. A tragic fluke. An unfortunate case of wandering off. These woods had eaten more people than the local papers cared to report, and Evelyn knew the town's memory was short. But now that Lucia had asked questions, now that the police might sniff around, everything was unraveling. She dialed another number, one that didn't appear in her contacts. A man's voice answered after a single ring. "You said you clean up messes." Silence. "I need a story created, one that buries a boy who doesn't want to be found." The voice gave a number. She agreed without hesitation. Later that afternoon, a gray SUV rolled out of a backroad garage outside Santa Rosa. Its license plates were untraceable. The man driving it wore a flannel shirt over a Kevlar vest and had a camera with a zoom lens in the back seat, not for art, but for evidence, for leverage. Evelyn climbed into the passenger seat. Her smile was calm now, lacquered back into place. "He's not far," she said. "Boys always think they're braver than they are, but they always circle back." The man grunted, started the engine, and they drove. Meanwhile, deep within the tree line, Noah and Ranger pushed through terrain thick with memory and mud. What began as a dirt path had bled into a marshland, the trail disappearing beneath sheets of moss and stagnant water. Ranger stepped cautiously, muscles tightening with every squelch of earth beneath his hooves. Noah sat light on his back, legs wet from the knees down, eyes darting at every snapping twig, every ripple. They didn't speak, of course. They hadn't needed to since the whistle. But something in Noah had shifted. He wasn't riding anymore. He was clinging, not out of fear, but need. This wasn't escape. It was survival. They emerged from the marsh into a stretch of abandoned railbed. Steel tracks rusted red with time, gravel swallowed by ferns, wooden planks snapped like brittle bones. A once functional artery now choked by wilderness. Ahead, the outline of a structure rose low, broken, skeletal, an old train station. Noah slid off Ranger's back. His feet hit the gravel hard, wobbling under fatigue. But he walked anyway, drawn toward the building like it might hold some kind of answer. A shelter, maybe. Or just a moment to breathe. The station had no doors, just a yawning mouth of shadow. He stepped inside. The air was thick with mildew and animal musk. Vines crept through broken window panes. A toppled bench lay against one wall. Old graffiti peeled from rusted steel columns. And on one crumbling plaster wall, blank, untouched, Noah paused. He dug into his backpack, pulled out a Sharpie he'd carried since the 2nd grade. Its cap was chewed and cracked, but it still worked. He wrote, in careful, deliberate letters, "People leave you, nature doesn't." He underlined it once. Then again, then he added a final word below, in smaller letters. N.W. Ranger stood just outside, nose twitching, ears angled sharply to the left. A noise. Noah turned. "What is it?" The horse didn't move. Noah crept back outside. Then he heard it too. An engine. Low, far away. Approaching. He ducked behind the station's wall, peering through a crack in the boards. The gray SUV crept down a trail that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, tires slicing through fern and loam like a scalpel. Evelyn was in the passenger seat, sunglasses gone now, her expression hollowed out into a kind of surgical calm. Noah ducked lower. His breath caught. He looked at Ranger. The horse looked back at him, no fear, just readiness. They had to move. He clambered onto Ranger's back again, faster this time. The connection was stronger now, the balance almost natural. Ranger turned without command, hooves pounding over old gravel, cutting back into the trees before headlights could sweep them into the frame. Inside the SUV, Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "They're close," she said. The man beside her adjusted the camera's settings. "You sure you want this documented? If we control the story," she said, "we control the outcome." Further north, tucked between a ravine and a creek swollen from spring thaw, a cabin squatted in defiance of time. It looked abandoned, but it wasn't Inside lived a man known only as Walter. He hadn't seen the world in over 2 decades, not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. The world had already taken his sight. A blast from a malfunctioning forge 2 towns over had turned his retinas to ash. He'd retreated into the woods, built his walls, and listened. To birds, to trees, to everything that didn't lie. He heard them long before they arrived. The hooves, the breathing, the rhythm of something untrained, but not wild. He stepped onto his porch, leaning on a cane he made himself. When Ranger and Noah broke through the tree line, the boy froze. Ranger did not. Walter held up one hand. "Stop." Ranger stopped. Walter took a slow breath. "That's no regular horse," he said. Noah blinked. "You can't even see him." "I don't need eyes for this one. I can feel him in my chest." Noah dismounted. Walter stepped forward, using sound more than shape. He reached out with calloused fingers and found the horse's flank. Ranger flinched at first, then stilled. Walter slid his hand down the leg, to the hoof. Crouched. "Lift," he said gently. Ranger did. Walter ran his hand along the edge. Then, his thumb found a ridge where there shouldn't be one. A slight warp in the curvature. A scar beneath the sole. "Bastards used a concave nail," he muttered. "Bends under pressure. Cuts deep. Cheap trick to punish a horse that resists." Noah's throat tightened. "Who would do that?" Walter stood slowly. "Same kind who calls pain training." He tapped the hoof once. "Needs rebalance. If he keeps running on this, he'll split." Noah looked around. "Can you fix it?" Walter tilted his head. "Not today, but I can give you a few hours." He turned toward the cabin. "Bring him in." Inside, the place was cluttered with tools, metals, books, jars full of liquids Noah couldn't name. The air smelled like ash and cedar. A forge, long dormant, sat cold in the corner, but its presence filled the room like a heart still beating under the floorboards. Walter guided Ranger to a makeshift wooden stand and began working bare hands, no gloves, moving with confidence born not from sight, but instinct. He spoke as he worked. "You ever hear of the horse called Ash?" Noah shook his head. "Ran from a fire once. Through miles of burning forest. Carried a kid who couldn't walk. When they found them, the horse's legs were raw to the bone, but the kid didn't have a scratch." He paused. "This one feels like Ash." Noah stared at Ranger, silent. Walter smiled. "You're not the first pair to come through these woods lost and looking." Outside, the forest shifted again. The SUV had stopped less than half a mile from Walter's cabin. The man with the camera stepped out first. Evelyn followed, her shoes sinking into moss. "Where's the trail go?" she asked. The man pointed. "Hearing hooves, that way." She scanned the trees. "Let's find our miracle boy." She didn't smile this time. The ranger station sat quiet beneath a wash of morning haze, nestled between 2 shoulders of Redwood hills. From afar, it looked like an abandoned outpost, peeling paint, radio antenna tilting like a broken spine, but the lights were on, faint inside, casting a yellow hue against the fog. Evelyn approached slowly. Her scarf was arranged just so, her hair was undone on purpose, Her mascara had been blurred by the precise application of bottled tears. She burst through the door. Two park rangers looked up from their desk, middle-aged men in weatherproof uniforms, caught off guard by the theatrics. "I need help," she sobbed. "It's my nephew. He's missing. He ran off, I think." She choked on air. "He's unstable. He has these delusions. He talks to animals, to trees. Please." The older ranger stood slowly. "Ma'am, when did you last see him?" "2 days ago," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, maybe 1.5. He doesn't know this area. He gets confused. He thinks horses talk to him. I tried to keep him safe. I did." "All right," the ranger said gently. "We'll file a report. Just take a breath." She sniffled. "Thank you." Her fingers dug into the leather strap of her purse, tight enough to turn her knuckles white. From her coat pocket, a burner phone vibrated once. She didn't answer. Not yet. She had planted the story. Now, she just needed the ending. In the mountains above, the forest opened into a dry saddleback between ridgelines, sun spilling like gold through the pines. Noah clung to Ranger's mane, knees pressing against the horse's shoulders as they climbed higher and higher. There was no trail now, no signposts, only instinct. Ranger wasn't just following, he was leading. His head moved with certainty, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Every time he stopped, it wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. Then, they reached it. A ridge flattened out into a clearing small, almost sacred. At the far edge stood a flagpole, cracked with rust, rope long gone. The cloth at its peak was faded, half torn, swaying slightly in the wind. An old American flag. Its red had turned rust orange, its white the color of old teeth. The blue had bled to sky, but it was still there, still upright. Ranger stopped, stared. Noah looked at the flag, then at the horse. "What is this place?" Ranger didn't answer, of course. But something passed between them, an understanding that this forgotten crest in the forest meant something. Freedom, maybe. Survival. Or just a vantage point no one else had claimed. Noah slid off Ranger's back. The air was thinner here, lighter. He fumbled for his phone again. 1 bar. He nearly cried. He opened the compass app. Nothing. He checked maps. Blank. But maybe, something analog. He dug into his pocket, pulled out the whistle, then checked his wrist. The old watch Margaret had given him, sun-scratched and water-stained, still worked. Its metal face reflected the sun like a mirror. He looked at the ridge across the valley. If someone was watching, maybe from a tower, or from one of those Ranger Fire lookouts, he might be seen. He angled the watch face, aimed it toward the horizon, and began to tilt it rhythmically, reflecting bursts of sunlight. 3 short flashes. A pause. 3 more. SOS. Then he blew the whistle once, then twice. The sound didn't carry far, but it was paired now with something louder. Hope. Behind him, Ranger shifted. Then he heard something, not far. Footsteps. Human. Snapping twigs in a rushed, deliberate rhythm. Noah turned and felt the blood leave his face. Through the trees on the southern edge of the clearing, Evelyn appeared, disheveled, eyes wild, boots dirty. Her lips curled into something that pretended to be a smile. "There you are," she called, her voice too sweet, too smooth. "I've been looking everywhere." Noah stepped back. "You left me," he said. "I made a mistake," she cooed, walking slowly forward. "I panicked. I thought you were right behind me. You threw away my phone. I was trying to protect you. You're just a child, Noah. You don't understand how dangerous this place is." Behind her, the man with the camera emerged. He didn't speak, just held up the lens, focused. "You're lying," Noah whispered. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the flag, then the watch, then the whistle. "Oh," she said softly. "You've been busy." Ranger stepped between them. Evelyn flinched. "Move," she said, taking one more step. Ranger didn't. Noah climbed back onto his back. This time, no hesitation, no ceremony. The horse turned, angled toward the ridge trail that dropped sharply into a narrow canyon. Evelyn lunged. No, Ranger bolted. Down the trail, fast, faster than before. Noah gripped his mane, face whipped by branches. Dirt kicked behind them. The world blurred. The ridge vanished. Behind, Evelyn screamed. The cameraman cursed, dropped the camera, and ran after them. But he couldn't follow. The trail narrowed. Steep cliffs on either side. Then, disaster. A wet patch of moss. A missed hoof. Ranger skidded. Noah slipped. He fell sideways, tumbled, arms flailing, then vanished off the path, down a shallow ravine, into a creek. Splash. Everything went white with cold. He surfaced, gasping. The current wasn't strong, but it dragged. His limbs flailed. He reached for anything, branches, rocks, but everything slipped. "Ranger!" His cry was swallowed by the trees. The water pulled him to the far side, wedging him beneath a fallen log. He clung to it, shivering, trying to breathe. Then he heard hooves. Ranger stood at the top of the bank, nostrils wide, tail flicking. He paced, searched, calculated. Then did something no animal should know how to do. He turned, backed up, charged, not at the boy, but at a tree. A narrow birch, half rotted at the root. He slammed into it. Once, twice. It groaned, leaned, cracked, and fell, crashing into the ravine. The trunk landed over the creek, just above Noah. A bridge. Noah reached, pulled himself across, gasping. His knees hit the earth. His fingers dug into the dirt. He turned and looked up. Ranger was waiting, silent, but present. Noah stood slowly, stumbled up the embankment. When he reached the top, he collapsed against the horse's neck. "Thank you," he choked out. Ranger snorted, shook his mane. They didn't wait. They ran again deeper into the woods, away from Evelyn, away from the camera, away from the place where death nearly happened, and toward the place where life might begin again. The forest exploded into motion. From the driver's seat of the gray SUV, Evelyn gritted her teeth, one hand yanking the wheel, the other gripping the dashboard like it owed her blood. The tires spat gravel as the vehicle tore through a narrow maintenance trail no vehicle was meant to use, bumping and skidding with every bend. Ahead, just vanishing into the trees, was a flicker of chestnut movement and the blur of a boy's sweatshirt. Ranger and Noah, clinging to his back like a shadow with a heartbeat. Evelyn slammed her palm against the horn, but the noise was pointless. The forest didn't care, and neither did the ones it protected. "Faster!" she hissed. Her voice was a thread unraveling. "He can't get out. Not now. Not after everything." The man in the passenger seat, the fixer with the camera, didn't speak. His job was already done. Photos of Noah alone, of the horse looking wild, of a child in imagined danger. But the chase, this wasn't part of the plan. Up ahead, Ranger moved like no horse should have been able to, his hooves slicing into dirt, moss, shale, roots. His flanks gleamed with sweat. His breath shot in clouds from his nostrils, but he never faltered. With each bound, he seemed to gather the entire story behind him and hurl it forward into legend. Noah didn't speak. His hands were tangled in Ranger's mane, fingers white with pressure, but his eyes were open, wide, locked ahead, focused. They were no longer a boy and a horse. They were one machine, one answer, one refusal to disappear. Ranger made a hard turn, leaping a fallen log with inches to spare, then cut across a shallow ravine, spraying mud behind him like a storm. The SUV couldn't keep pace now. The trees were too close, the trail too narrow. "Cut them off," Evelyn snapped. "There's a crossing down by the old railroad bed." The driver nodded, jerked the wheel, and Ranger kept running. Far ahead, the trees began to thin, light, a glint of steel. Noah's heart surged. The old railroad. They broke through a wall of ferns and out into an overgrown clearing. The tracks stretched in both directions like the remnants of a forgotten highway, and down the bend flashing lights, a sheriff's cruiser. Two officers, parked in mid-conversation, looked up just in time to see it, a wild horse barreling toward them, ridden bareback by a child, both faces fierce and shining and unafraid. One officer's mouth dropped open. "What the hell?" Ranger didn't slow. The cruiser was blocking the path. At the last second, Noah ducked low and whispered something, maybe to the horse, maybe to the wind. Ranger turned, feared, not away, but into history. A roar behind them. The SUV burst from the trees. Evelyn screamed as she saw the cruiser. But the car didn't stop. It hurtled forward, past a posted sign, "Do not cross, active patrol zone." The cruiser's doors opened. One officer raised his hand. "Stop the vehicle." The driver didn't, but then Ranger did. He turned in one sweeping arc, hooves tearing into the dirt beside the tracks, and ran straight at the SUV. Noah held tight, face buried in the horse's neck, and in the last 20 feet, Ranger threw his full weight sideways across the path of the SUV. It all happened at once. The SUV skidded, the tires screeched, the hood pitched downward, and the front bumper kissed the forest floor with a thunderous crack. Steam hissed from under the hood, and everything went still. For a moment, there was only the smell of burnt rubber and hot metal. Then, the officers ran in, guns unholstered. "Hands where I can see them." The fixer stepped out first, hands up, calm. He knew when it was time to pivot. But Evelyn, she lost it. She threw open the door, stumbled into the ferns, hair wild, eyes wide. "He's mine," she shrieked. "He's disturbed. That horse is dangerous. They're both dangerous. You don't understand." "Ma'am, stop moving. Put your hands." "You don't get it. He doesn't belong with that thing. He's sick. I'm saving him." And then her voice broke. "I'm the only one who ever gave a damn." That was when Noah slid off Ranger's back and walked forward. One of the deputies moved to intercept, but Noah raised a hand not to resist, but to speak. "She left me," he said. His voice was clear. She told me to walk into the woods. She took my phone. She said no one would look for me. The younger deputy turned to the older. We've got body cams. Everything's on record. The older nodded slowly. Let's get her in cuffs. Evelyn didn't resist now. She just dropped into the grass like a coat off a wire hanger and sobbed. Later, the clearing transformed. Deputies, rangers, reporters. The whole machine that never shows up until it's over. Lucia arrived in a forest patrol vehicle, breathless, eyes wild, mouth trembling. She saw Noah, sprinted to him. He didn't cry until he was in her arms. I thought I'd never see you again, she whispered. I didn't think anyone was coming, he said, voice cracked with salt. She held him tighter. Ranger stood off to the side, flanked by 2 animal control officers. They didn't try to leash him. They wouldn't have dared. Someone whispered, "Is that one of the rescue horses? From the old ranch?" Another replied, "Thought they were all dead." A third, "Maybe this one just didn't forget." One of the cameras zoomed in on Noah's face. Someone asked, "Can you tell us what happened? What you felt out there?" Noah looked past them all to Ranger, to the tracks, to the forest, then turned back. "He found me," he said. "That horse?" "No," he said. "The truth." The evening news rolled it out with flair. 10-year-old boy survives alone in Redwood Forest with help from a mysterious horse. A banner under the anchor's face. The final gallop. Miracle or message? Reporters dug deep, not just into Evelyn's financials, her attempts to sell Margaret's home before her mother was even declared incapacitated, but also into her silent partnership with a man linked to the now defunct Redwood Equine Center, shut down for abuse, reopened under a shell name, and closed again without prosecution. The public wanted a villain. They had one, but they also wanted a symbol, and they had that too. The boy, the horse, and the story that galloped faster than any lie could chase. The sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding gold across the tops of the redwoods, when the news vans finally left. They'd come like a wave, reporters in stiff jackets with rehearsed gasps, camera operators threading cords between pine roots, drones buzzing above the clearing as if they could capture what the forest had already hidden. Their lenses focused on the spectacle, the final gallop, the image of a wild horse halting a runaway SUV, the 10-year-old survivor clutching its mane like a boy from myth. They played it in loops over and over, spliced between graphics and pre-recorded interviews with experts who had never been closer to a horse than a carousel. They dubbed it the Redwood Miracle. They made montages of Noah's face, slowed down footage of Ranger's turn across the tracks. They extracted sound bites, shaved context, and flattened the soul out of the story. No one asked about the house at the edge of town, the one with photos turned face down on the mantle. No one asked about the woman inside who sometimes mistook her own reflection for a stranger. They didn't want to know. Walter stood at the edge of the clearing as the last van pulled away. He didn't wave. Lucia was seated on a stump, Noah leaning against her knee like an old tree roots into the hill that bore it. They got what they came for, Walter said. Lucia didn't look up. They didn't come for the truth. He nodded once. Of course they didn't. That night, Noah sat on the cabin steps with Ranger beside him. The stars had returned, shy at first, then bolder. Crickets sang a fractured lullaby in the brush. The forest had reclaimed its quiet. Lucia brought out 2 mugs of warm milk and honey. She offered one to Noah. The other she placed gently near Ranger's hooves. The horse sniffed it once, then ignored it. Lucia sat beside them. "You were on every channel," she said softly. Noah didn't answer. CBS called. So did a documentary crew. Still, nothing. She placed her hand on his. "I told them no." He finally looked up. Her voice was clear, firm, loving. "There are stories meant to be told," she said, "and some that are meant to be lived." 2 days later, Walter hitched up a rusted trailer, its doors repaired and padded with hay. He wore his old denim shirt, sleeves rolled, gloves cracked at the seams. "I've got room at my place," he said. "Room for him. Big paddock, running water. I'll keep him safe." Noah nodded. "Yeah." Walter looked at Ranger, who stood 20 feet away, grazing near the fence. "Come on, big guy," Walter said gently. "Let's get you home." He approached, lead rope in hand. Ranger raised his head, watched. Walter slowed his steps. "I know you ain't used to ropes, but you've got nothing to be afraid of now." Another step. Ranger backed away. Not a trot, not panic, just a refusal. Walter stopped. He lowered the rope. "All right," he said after a beat. "All right." He turned toward Noah. "He's not mine." Noah looked confused. "What do you mean?" "He's yours. He's chosen. And animals like him, they don't pick lightly." Lucia stepped out onto the porch just as Margaret appeared behind her, frail, eyes sleepy, fingers grasping a shawl like it held her to the earth. Noah turned, startled. "Grandma?" Margaret blinked in the afternoon sun. She stepped slowly onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked beneath her, but she didn't falter. Her eyes found the horse, and something in her lit up. "Oh," she breathed. "That one." Noah moved toward her. "His name's Ranger." She didn't answer him. Her eyes were locked on the horse. She smiled. Not the vague smile of someone unsure, but a full, aching expression of joy. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the one from my dream." Noah furrowed his brow. "What dream?" She pointed a shaky hand. "The one with the fire-colored coat and the midnight mane. I was a girl, and he came to me in the orchard. I never told anyone. But you," she turned to Noah, "you brought him back." Ranger stepped forward. One step, then another. Noah froze. He watched his grandmother and the horse, two beings unmoored from time, draw closer. Margaret extended her hand. Ranger pressed his muzzle into it. She laughed. A bright, unfiltered sound. "I remember this." Noah turned to Lucia, his eyes wide. Lucia didn't speak, just nodded. That night, Lucia found the harmonica. It had sat for years in a wooden drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief, a gift from someone long dead. The reeds had dulled, but it still sang. She handed it to Margaret after dinner. The old woman looked at it like it was a puzzle piece. She didn't know she'd been missing. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor. Lucia took her place at the window, and Margaret lifted the harmonica to her lips. The first note was cracked. The second wavered. But the third rang out across the room like a bird taking flight for the first time in winter. A slow, meandering melody emerged, half lullaby, half hymn. Outside the window, Ranger stood still, listening. The forest listened too. Noah closed his eyes. The music grew bolder, warmer, like sap melting in spring, like memory returning. When the final note drifted into silence, Margaret lowered the harmonica. She looked at her hands like she didn't recognize them, then turned to Noah. "Was I good?" He nodded, too choked to speak. She smiled. "I used to play for your father." Noah's lip quivered. Lucia came over and rested a hand on his shoulder. "He used to cry, just like you." Noah wiped his face. "I think you saved him," he whispered. Margaret looked puzzled, but not sad. Outside, Ranger snorted once, then bowed his head. Noah started sleeping through the night. Lucia stopped locking the back door. Walter visited once a week. He brought apples and old stories and never asked for more than a few minutes by the fence. Margaret had her good days and her drifting days, but she remembered Ranger, always Ranger. And sometimes, when the fog was thin and the wind just right, she would play again, the same tune, the same rhythm, a melody never recorded, a story never televised, but deeply known. They never went back to the old house. It stood there still, empty and waiting furniture, cloaked in white sheets, mail gathering dust in the hallway, memories clinging to the wallpaper like ghosts too tired to haunt. But Noah never crossed its threshold again. He didn't need to. Instead, they followed Walter's footsteps into the forest, along an unmarked trail that split from the road like a secret. At the end of it, nestled between two ancient redwoods and a creek that sang at dusk, stood a house made of weathered logs and stubborn grace, a home that hadn't been touched in years. It leaned a little, one shutter hung crooked, but it breathed. Walter handed them the key like he was giving away a piece of his own marrow. "My mother died in that front room," he said, voice low but steady, "and I was born in the back." Lucia laid her hand over his. "We'll keep the silence intact." Walter nodded once. "That's all it asks for." And just like that, the cabin was theirs. Noah moved in first, feet bare, eyes wide, lungs expanding in ways they hadn't in months. The first thing he did was roll up the dusty rug in the center of the living room and slide it into the sun. Beneath it, a floorboard carved with names, dates scratched in by hand, initials faded into the grain. He added one more, NW plus RW. Margaret took the window-facing room. Lucia placed her rocker by the glass and opened the curtains wide every morning. And Ranger? He found his place before anyone told him where it was. Beside the creek, under the walnut tree, just within sight of the porch. He didn't wear a halter. He never would again. Lucia quit the nursing home with no apology. They asked her why. She said, "Because I'm needed somewhere that still believes people can get better." They offered her a raise. She offered them silence. She moved into the cabin with one suitcase and a heart both broken and healing. Her room was small, just enough for a mattress, a shelf of poetry books, and a hook for her wide-brimmed hat. She didn't try to be a mother to Noah. She didn't try to be a daughter to Margaret. She just stayed, and that was enough. Noah stopped writing in his journal, not because he had nothing left to say, but because everything he needed to say had started living in the world around him, in the routines he built, in the rituals he protected. He woke up with the sun. He fed Ranger by hand. He swept the porch. And every afternoon, when the wind shifted and the valley filled with golden light, he walked down to the clearing below the ridge, where 3 or 4 neighborhood kids from the surrounding mountain homes would already be waiting, shy, skeptical, curious. They came from all kinds of places. The boy with the stutter whose parents yelled more than they spoke. The girl who only wore black and wouldn't touch another human being but asked to brush Ranger's mane. The twins whose mother worked nights and slept through mornings. They didn't come for therapy. They came for Ranger. Noah never gave them rules. He gave them space. Ranger never gave them tricks. He gave them presence. Together, they learned the first lesson. You don't ride a horse to control it. You ride to remember you're not alone. No reins. No bits, just trust. One afternoon, as the shadows stretched long across the grass, the boy with the stutter, Milo, approached Noah. Why does he let us?" he asked. Noah looked at Ranger, who stood nearby, head low, eyes soft. "Because we don't make him." Milo nodded, like that made more sense than anything he'd heard in school. Later that week, the girl in black left a bracelet tied to Ranger's tail. It wasn't fancy. Just leather cord and a small glass bead. He kept it there for days. Lucia sat on the porch every evening and watched it unfold, this quiet miracle of children returning to themselves. She didn't document it. She didn't post it. She didn't even talk about it. She just bore witness. Margaret had good days and disappearing ones. Some mornings, she'd play harmonica for an hour, notes drifting through the trees like smoke from an old fire. Other mornings, she'd ask who the boy in the hallway was, or if Ranger had brought the mail. But always, she remembered his name, not Noah's. Ranger's. "Where's the flame horse?" she'd ask, and someone would point, and her face would light up like it had before the world began unraveling. Walter visited every Thursday. He never knocked. Just walked in, left apples on the kitchen counter, and leaned against the doorframe while Margaret napped or Lucia stirred soup. He didn't speak much, but when he did, the words stayed. One afternoon, he stood beside Noah as they watched Ranger doze beneath the walnut tree. "You've given him back something no human ever should have taken." "What's that?" Noah asked. His story. People started hearing things, not rumors. Songs. Children humming strange little tunes at the market that no adult recognized. Old hikers speaking of a boy and a horse and a redwood cabin where no one asked you what you did for a living. Even the ranger from the old patrol unit came by once, just to sit, just to breathe. "I don't know what this is," he said. Lucia smiled. "That's the point." One night, it rained hard. Not a storm, exactly. Just a steady, pulsing downpour like the forest had been holding its breath for weeks, and finally let go. Noah stood outside, barefoot, letting the drops soak through his shirt, down his spine, into the earth. Ranger stepped out of the shed, nostrils wide, mane plastered to his neck. Noah walked to him. No halter, no rope. He pressed his forehead to the horses, and whispered, "You don't have to run anymore." Ranger exhaled, long and slow. The rain fell harder. Noah closed his eyes and smiled. In the months that followed, people brought their forgotten things to the forest. A grandfather and his grandson came to return an old saddle, one that had once belonged to a horse named Rusty, beaten and taken. They left it beneath the walnut tree. A woman mailed a letter with no return address, just the words, "I'm sorry for what we did to you." Inside, a photo of a younger ranger, eyes hollow. Lucia never displayed them. She buried them beneath a redwood sapling. Let them become part of the root system. Let them decompose. Let them feed something better. The cabin didn't become famous, but it did become known. Not through screens, not through headlines, but through people, quiet people, who'd seen too much, lost too much, and finally, heard something calling them back. When they arrived, they didn't ask questions. They just sat, listened, watched the boy who no longer wrote things down because his whole life was the story now, and the horse who had no name until he chose one, and the woman whose silence was her sermon, and the elder who played music only trees remembered. They called Ranger the keeper of the forest breath, not because he owned it, but because he returned it, to the broken, to the unseen, to those who had lost the rhythm of their own hearts. The envelope was thick, white, and glossy. Noah stared at it in silence. The gold-lettered logo in the corner screamed louder than any voice. Atlas Pictures. Lucia read the letter over his shoulder. They want rights to the story. A series. 3 seasons guaranteed. He didn't speak. They'll call it The Boy and the Flame Horse, she added with a faint grimace. Apparently they think Ranger's marketable. Noah closed the envelope, slowly, deliberately, then tucked it into the old coffee tin they used for kindling. He didn't say no, he just didn't say anything. And, in this place, silence carried more weight than rejection. Lucia gave a small smile. "I guess that's a no." Noah finally looked up at her. "There's nothing heroic about surviving something you never should have had to." She nodded. He looked out the window where Ranger stood beneath the walnut tree, grazing without hurry. "I don't want people watching," Noah said. I want them remembering. The idea came to him on a day when the creek ran faster than usual, its current swollen with late spring runoff. He was standing on the ridge where he and Ranger had first seen the old flag. He remembered how it fluttered, not strong, but still persistent. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, wrote out invitations in pencil on salvaged paper, and tacked them to trees, bulletin boards, mailboxes, and the backs of church pews. He called it Freedom for the Forgotten, a gathering in the Redwoods. No RSVP. No camera crews. Just come as you are, if you still remember who you were. They came quietly. A woman in a lavender shawl who hadn't spoken aloud in 3 years. A boy with a hearing aid and bruises older than he was. An old man in hospice who insisted on being pushed in his wheelchair to see that damn horse with my own eyes. A couple who had lost their daughter and had nothing left but grief, and a half-remembered lullaby she used to hum about rivers that knew your name. Margaret was dressed in a blue cardigan with mismatched buttons. She didn't know why she was smiling. She just was. Lucia brushed her hair gently that morning. You don't need to remember the beginning, she whispered. Just be here for the middle. Walter arrived early, left his truck a half-mile down the trail, and walked the rest on foot, cane tapping like punctuation marks behind every step. The meadow behind the cabin had been cleared by hand. Tables from scrap wood, paper lanterns, one speaker hooked to an old car battery. Noah didn't rehearse. He wore jeans, a button-down, and no shoes. The grass was cold. Ranger stood at the edge of the trees, watching. Noah stepped up to the small platform they'd built from pine boards and old fence rails. He looked out over the crowd, 30 people, maybe 40. Not a single one trying to record it. He took a breath, then spoke into the wooden microphone Walter had carved. People say the woods are quiet, he began, but they're wrong. Pause. They're just patient. He looked down at his paper, then folded it and put it in his pocket. I was supposed to disappear, he said. But I didn't, and not because someone found me, because something heard me. He looked toward the trees. Ranger stepped forward, not galloping, just walking, like a heartbeat returning. He moved through the crowd without halter, without command. He passed the woman in the lavender shawl, and she reached out. He brushed her palm with his nose, and she cried without sound. He stopped beside the old man in the wheelchair. The man looked at him like a man who once had faith and forgot it. "Goddamn," he whispered. Noah watched. "This horse," he said, "he doesn't carry people. He carries what they forgot." Silence. Then, he lifted a small wooden speaker box built by hand, wrapped in linen, and placed it at the edge of the platform. He pressed a button. Static. Then a soft hum. Then Noah's voice, pre-recorded, reciting the poem he never showed anyone. There are words too sharp to say out loud. So we carve them into wood, or press them into the dirt with our feet. There are faces too fragile for television. They live behind broken windows, and sing to empty stoves. There are wounds too wide for rescue. They don't bleed anymore. They echo. And sometimes, if you listen just right, you'll hear silence, speaking louder than any name. He stepped back. Lucia stood behind Margaret, who was staring straight ahead, eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on Ranger. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the harmonica. Lucia looked at her, startled. Margaret raised it slowly. Her lips pressed against the cool metal. The sound that came out was fractured, then whole, then holy. A melody not perfect, but true, the same she'd played before. Only this time, the notes didn't wander. They returned, they circled, and the wind carried them through the crowd like ash from an old fire reborn into warmth. Walter took off his hat. Lucia wiped her face, not hiding it. Ranger closed his eyes and lowered his head. The ceremony ended without fanfare. No final applause, no call to action. Just a meal passed hand to hand, just children running through the grass, just elders nodding to one another in quiet gratitude, just Ranger, grazing near the edge, the last light of day catching his coat and making it burn like the first sunrise after a long winter. Noah stood beside him, hand resting against his shoulder. "You're not just mine," he whispered. "You're everyone's." And the horse, silent as ever, blinked once. That night, Lucia tucked Margaret into bed. She smiled up at the ceiling. "What was today?" she asked. Lucia brushed her hair back. A remembering, Margaret nodded, then drifted off. On the porch, Noah sat alone. A copy of the rejected contract still sat in the fire pit. He struck a match, let it catch, watched the gold-embossed letters curl into black. Ranger stood at the edge of the yard, watching, not coming closer, just watching. Like he knew Noah didn't need company tonight, just witness. Because freedom doesn't come from riding. It comes from knowing when to stop, to breathe, to let something end without fear that it might not begin again, to say no to spectacle, to say yes to stillness. And, in the Redwoods, that night, the wind stopped, not from silence, but from respect. The forest was still that morning. No wind, no birdsong, only light filtered and golden, pouring through the redwoods like it had traveled lifetimes just to arrive here. Inside the cabin, the world was hushed. The clock didn't tick, the kettle didn't hiss. The only sound was a breath soft, shallow, final. Margaret lay in bed, her face turned slightly toward the window, her hand curled around something small. It was the wooden whistle, the one she carved for Noah, the one that once echoed through the darkness and brought a ghost of freedom to life. Noah sat beside her, his hand over hers. He didn't cry, not yet. He just stared at her stillness, at the gentle way the morning touched her skin, at the way the corners of her mouth had lifted ever so slightly, as if she'd been mid-lullaby in her dream. Lucia stood in the doorway, holding back the tears that had lived behind her eyes for days. "She's gone," she whispered, though the room already knew. Noah leaned forward, kissed Margaret's forehead, and closed her eyes. Then stood, walked outside. He spent the day carving, didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't want help. He walked deep into the woods with a shovel, the whistle, and a stone slab he'd dragged behind him by rope. By dusk, he'd cleared a space between two ancient trees, where the ground was soft and the wind whispered low. He buried the whistle first, pressed it into the earth with both hands. Then, Margaret, wrapped in a woven blanket that smelled like pine. Lucia came, but stood back. Walter helped lower the stone without a word. It wasn't polished. It wasn't engraved with her birth year or a surname or any scripture. It simply read, "She found her way home." The following morning, Ranger came to the site. He didn't touch the grave, didn't sniff the stone. He just stood at its edge, eyes forward. Then, as if cued by something deep inside him, he lifted a hoof and struck the ground. Once, twice, 3 times, then turned, and walked into the forest. Noah didn't follow. Lucia reached for his hand. He didn't take it, but he didn't pull away either. That evening, Noah sat on the porch alone. He stared into the trees. He didn't know if Ranger would return. Didn't know if he was supposed to. Some things don't come back because they're not lost. They're just finished. And he understood now, freedom isn't about holding on. It's about letting go without fear. He looked down at his hands, calloused from days of carving, and he began to carve again. A new whistle, smaller, rounder, shaped from a fallen branch he'd found the week before the one Margaret once pointed at and said, "Looks like it wants to sing." He worked into the night, sanding it smooth, then placed it on the windowsill. Weeks passed, then months. The cabin became more than shelter. It became story. Lucia planted wildflowers beside the grave. Walter returned on weekends, helping teach the children how to balance on saddle without fear, because the kids had come, one by one, from shelters, from foster homes, from grandparents who were too tired to chase them. They came without words, but they came with bruises, questions, and empty pockets. And somehow, they stayed. Noah didn't teach them how to ride. He taught them how to trust. "Don't pull the reins," he'd say. "Just listen to the rhythm of the hooves. They know more than you do." And sometimes, in the farthest part of the meadow, when dusk softened the trees and breath became visible, a dark silhouette would appear, watching, never near, never gone. The new whistle sat in a box Noah carved by hand. It wasn't a toy, it was a promise. And one day, he gave it away. The boy was 6, small, skittish, didn't speak for the first 3 days. Noah found him staring at the fire with eyes that looked older than anyone in the room. He placed the whistle in his hands and said nothing. The boy clutched it tight. That night, he snuck out to the meadow. No one followed. Noah waited by the door, eyes fixed on the tree line. Then it came. Faint at first, then clearer. A whistle slightly off pitch, trembling, but full of longing. And from the shadows, something moved. A shape, a breath, a flick of flame-colored mane against bark. Ranger, slow, measured, answering not with speed, but with presence. The boy fell to his knees. Ranger approached, didn't sniff, didn't rear, just stood. The boy reached forward. The horse lowered his head. Their foreheads touched, and in that moment, a circle closed, not with spectacle, but with stillness. Inside the cabin, Noah watched through the glass. Lucia stood behind him. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Walter sat at the table, humming a tune Margaret once played on her harmonica. The fire crackled. The night wrapped around them like an old blanket. Noah closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his lids, he saw her not frail, not lost, but walking through the forest with her hand outstretched, wind in her hair, and the whistle swinging gently from a cord around her neck. He smiled, not from happiness, but from freedom. And as the screen darkened, the words appeared in white, simple text. "Freedom isn't running away, it's being heard when you call."